Good morning and welcome back to this important conference. My name is Bassirou Chitou and I'm the Dean of the African School of Economics, Abidjan campus. At African School of Economics, we try to gather practitioners, researchers, and policymakers and provide them with the tools in quantitative economics, impact evaluation, and data science so that they can help decision makers inform policies based on evidence. So you are invited as a professional or young researcher to come and visit us and partner with us to help our continent and the world make a better place. Without further ado, this first panel will address important issues on attitude and policies towards refugees. In particular, it is well known that social cohesion is a key factor for development and growth. You will agree with me, right? For this reason, development partners, in particular UNHCR and advocacy group, encourage host countries to design inclusive policy that facilitate refugees' integration in the host community. In fact, Allport 1954 suggested that under certain conditions, contact can reduce prejudice and discrimination. Moreover, Lowy 2020 argued that adversary contact can have negative impact on economic and social outcome. Now, using evidence from Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, and some other low-income countries, this first panel will try to provide insights, practical insight into attitude and policy toward refugees, and explore the relationship between labor market competitions due to refugees numbers in various countries. The expert on this panel that will address those issues are Thomas Ginn from CDG, yeah? May from Victoria University, is that? Colette from Victoria University and May from Stanford? Just Stanford. So the first panelist is May. Oh, what?
We have Thomas.
Oh, Thomas. So let's have Thomas. Okay, great.
All right. You hear me? Fantastic. All right. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be back here. Thank you so much. So yesterday, presented a randomized control trial in one specific area with kind of great identification, the gold standard there. And here I'm going to go the opposite direction. I'm going to look sort of more globally around the world with a different sort of methodology. But hope we can also learn something useful. And so this is joint work with Savat Aksoy at EBRD in King's College London, and then also Franco Malpassi at PhD student at Northwestern University. Let's see. There we go. All right. So to start off, at least 55% of refugees live in countries that significantly restrict their access to work and their access to the labor market in terms of de facto practices. So this is from a report that we co-authored with at CGD with Refugees International and Asylum Access, looking at de facto conditions for refugees around the world. And so we go through and note all of the evidence around the large negative effects on refugees for labor market restrictions and other restrictions that are intuitive and clear, and obviously not the reason that these policies are adopted, and also document some of the evidence around missed opportunities for host communities where refugees are not allowed to integrate and face many more restrictions on their right to work, on freedom of movement, on things like that. So why do country governments impose these restrictions? Well, we hear all of these arguments in high-income countries as well, that they protect their citizens from potential crowd out of jobs, no matter what the evidence on average says. Obviously, there's also arguments around maintaining social cohesion. They're, of course, worried about their political incentives and boosting their political approval. And then you hear many other concerns around maybe making integration will decrease the likelihood of return, that integration will facilitate, will lead to more security issues, all kinds of arguments for why the impacts on the host communities would be much more negative with more inclusive policies. Yet, inclusive policies could foster sort of mutual gains and positive relations and we have some evidence for that in the context where it's allowed. Next slide, please. Yeah, I don't think this is working. It's okay. So in this paper, we're going to look at economic, social, and political outcomes around the world and how those are affected by the arrival of refugee populations. So that's going to be sort of the first overall question. Obviously, there's many papers that look at this, and we're going to take a sort of more global view. Then we're going to ask how these effects and outcomes differ across places with more and less restrictive policies. So do places that impose more restrictions on refugees do they evolve differently than places where they allow more inclusion when refugees arrive? So for data reasons, we're going to focus on low and middle income countries where there's relatively less research. And so the way we're going to do this is we're going to look at subnational regions, so administrative levels, that within countries that experience a rapid increase in their refugee population, and look at how those regions evolve both on their own, and then in the paper we go through how they evolve relative to other regions in those specific countries. Next slide. Great. So how are we going to do this? We're going to take three main data sets to look at this question. So the first data set, we are working with UNHCR on some data that they have again, across low and middle income countries that has much more geospatially disaggregated locations for refugees from it's 2000 to 2018, but we're going to zoom in on 2005 to 2018 in this paper. And so we're going to be working with UNHCR to fill in the gaps of the mini gaps that are in that data, and then aggregate it to other levels that we can merge with the two other data sets we're going to use. The next data set is the Gallup World Poll, which is a representative survey done around the world every year from 2005 to 2018 that asks a standard battery of questions to people around the world. And so some of those questions are on all of these economic, social, and political outcomes. And so we've got a wide range of both temporal across time and then across countries. So then we're going to combine this data set with data on de jure labor market access. So this is the Developing World and Asylum Policy data set that Guy Grossman is leading with his co-authors. And so this is an initial version of that data, and I know that it's the new version is about to be released, which we're excited about. So all of this, because both of the DRAP data and the UNHCR data are preliminary, this is all preliminary work, and excited to incorporate these new data sets. But overall, as of now, we find no significant effects. And when we look at these regions sort of before and after and compared to other regions in the country, we don't see that large refugee arrivals see, on average, a significant change in economic, political, or social outcomes. And then we also don't see that when we split these regions apart by places that allow more and less access, that those regions evolve differently. So get into the details here in a second. All right, so a little bit of background that I think is helpful because it's consistent with our findings. And so the first paper I want to highlight is from Palle Verme and Kirsten Schudler that do a meta-analysis of 49 studies on forced migration. And so they find that between 45 and 52% of the results on household well-being are positive and significant. 34 to 42% are insignificant, and 6 to 20% are negative. So there's a wide range, but there's no sort of clear story of what we would expect when we look at regions on average of how the sort of average refugee flow is going to affect host communities. So that's with respect to economic outcomes. Then when we look at attitudes, Potty, Sherman, and Wilkes find that more than half of these results show no relationship between attitudes and then the size of the immigration flow. And the remainder shows both positive and negative effects. So again, looking sort of across the literature, people might have their priors on this one case that showed negative effects toward immigrants when immigrants arrive. But these meta-analyses are arguing that there's actually sort of no clear consensus in the literature on both these economic and social outcomes. But all of these single contexts, even combined into meta-analyses, might not generalize to places where we don't have data in order to look at that specific country. And so we think that's the value of then zooming out globally and taking the Gallup World Poll to a wide variety of settings. Great. So again, the three data sets that we're going to use, we're going to start with the Gallup World Poll. Then we're going to go through the data on refugee populations from UNHCR, and then I'll talk about the data on refugees' right to work, and then we're going to combine that with other data from the World Bank and from aid data. All right, so what is the Gallup World Poll? It conducts annual nationally representative surveys of about 1,000 people in each country on about 100 questions that are standardized across each country. So overall, this is over 2 million respondents from 168 countries from 2005 to 2018. So really sort of fascinating, broad look at global trends that can be quite useful. So the three main things that we're going to pull out from Gallup here today, first, a basic level of income. They ask per capita income. Then an attitudes measure that is, the question that they ask is this city or area where you live a good place to live for immigrants from other countries? So if I were designing this survey, this is not the question that I would ask, and I think has many, many drawbacks. However, it's the question that we have the most kind of temporal and spatial variation, so it's going to be the main measure we use. However, I'll talk a little bit more about how we try to validate this measure in the next slides. So the basic idea is that this measure strongly correlates with other data around immigration attitudes that I find much easier to interpret. But in the back of your mind, you should think about, is the actual question that's being asked, is this a good place to live? Could obviously have problems around like immigrants treatment. Usually we're talking about refugees instead of immigrants writ large, those sorts of things that I think do, pose a potentially problematic interpretation, but I think it's still worth looking at. Then the last question is more straightforward. Do you approve or disapprove of the job performance of the leadership of this country? Great. So the validation measure that we do on this attitudes measure is we take a subset of Gallup World Polls that then also ask much more standard interpretable questions about immigration. And so they ask questions like, would you also be happy to have immigrants as neighbors? What do you think the effects of immigration on crime is? Do you think that there should be more or less immigrants? Much more your standard sort of battery that this audience would be much more familiar with. And so then we're able to correlate that. This table is showing at the individual level that all of those measures, the 3 stars mean they're strongly correlated. At the individual level, that people say, no, this is not a good area, also are more negative toward immigrants on these other measures. And if they say yes, then they're also more positive toward immigrants on these measures. We can also do that at a regional level, looking at questions in Afrobarometer and all kinds of global multinational surveys that we also find this same effect or same correlation at the regional level, which is our argument for why looking at this variable, which gives us much more time and spatial variation, is a reasonable first pass at this question. The next data set we're going to combine is this data on refugee populations at the regional level. So UNHCR has these subnational data, which means like they sometimes have geo-coordinates, sometimes they have the district or the region where refugees live. And this is at within countries and within specific refugee nationalities, and then each year, starting from 2000, and it covers most of the low and middle income countries around the world. So this is going to be populations who are displaced outside of their country of birth. So that's refugees, also asylum seekers, Venezuelans displaced abroad, and others of concern. And so we've been going through these data very carefully, trying to match them with all kinds of other data sets that we have, and then imputing the many parts of these data that are missing in order to guess where refugees are most likely. So about 30% of the refugee populations are imputed. That's a different paper that we're still working on. But we hope that these data will be really valuable once they're out for everybody to use, again, at sort of the administrative 1 level, which, will have maybe 15, 20, 50 states within each country. Great, so here's a quick look. You can see the sort of variation within countries that we have sort of where refugees are. This is the last time, the last year in the data. And so you can see the variation of where refugees are, that we are taking UNHCR's data and trying to fill in the gaps. All right, and then the last data that we're going to combine is data on policy. And so these data are first sort of in the literature with Blair et al. In 2021. And so we're going to focus on the livelihoods component of these data. So the 5 questions that they go through in the law for every year from 1951 up to, these data are 2018, but I know that Guy will tell us more, that it's coming out through 2022, I believe. So these questions that we're looking at for the policy variable are, does the law or policy guarantee the right to work? Does it guarantee the right to self-employment? Does it guarantee the right to work in professional fields, provided an individual holds the requisite training, and so on? So all kinds of things about labor market access at the de jure level, at the national level. So then we're going to follow the same sort of methodology in terms of how we aggregate these that study does. And then so obviously we have concerns about how the de jure data matches to the de facto practices, right? Because if de jure is completely different, then we might not expect that we would find any meaningful differences between de jure and de facto areas. But in the report that I was talking about from our report in 2022, we take de jure and de facto data and find that they actually correlate quite strongly. And so that's reassuring for the value of being able to look at these, the policy variables and the de jure variables over time, that's going to, again, correlate strongly, and not just kind of around the world, but even within low income, middle income, and high income countries specifically. And so we think that then that's a good proxy for how refugees are integrated in practice. And so this is a quick map of sort of darker blue means more inclusive policies based on this index. But it's a fascinating data set that everybody should check out. All right, and so then how are we going to then combine all of these things and look at where refugees have arrived? So there's obviously a wide range of ways to do this. And so we're going to need to define sort of what constitutes a refugee arrival. And so the way we're going to have many different measures of this that we present in the paper. The specification, the sample that I'm going to present here are regions who have received 10,000 refugees in the space of 1 year. So we see an increase from 1 year to the next of 10,000 refugees and that or more. And that's going to be our sort of definition of a refugee arrival that we're going to look before and after that arrival. And so then in the paper, we go through a number of other different specifications, whether that is in terms of larger flows of refugees, percentage terms of refugee increases, or per capita jumps in terms of number of refugee arrivals. And we find basically the same thing across all of those, which is why I'm just going to present our sort of base specification that gives 10,000 refugees and gives us about that in these data is about 110 regions around the world that then see this magnitude of arrivals in 1 year to the next. Okay, and then we're going to look across sort of 8-year windows of these largest inflows of refugees. So we're going to take the maximum change within that period and then break that down into sort of pre and post arrivals. That gives us sort of 4-year blocks on both sides. And so we're going to be looking at this at sort of the region event level. And so then we're going to take regions that have outcomes both before and after, and then look at that at the region level. And we can do this at the individual level too. And again, we see similar results. Okay, so quickly, I think it's fascinating to break down these data comparing the global trend, the global data with how they compare to refugee access. And we see really that, there's some differences, but for the sake of this talk, that, attitudes don't differ significantly. Whether they're a good place for immigrants at the bottom don't differ significantly between places with sort of medium, high, and low access for immigrants based on that index that we create. Okay, so first, this is going to be our first stage of where refugees are arriving. So you can see that on the vertical axis is the refugee population. And then on the horizontal axis is taking what we call event time. So year 0 is the biggest jump from when refugees are arriving. And then so year -1 is the year before that, -2 is 2 years before that, and then going the opposite direction all the way to sort of 3 years out. And so you can see our trends here it's not 0 refugees in these regions to start with, but there's significantly fewer refugees. And then we see this large jump at the red line, which is where, okay, now these regions have seen a significant inflow of refugees from 1 year to the next. And then we're going to, then you see sort of after that things also sort of flatten out on average. So then I'm going to show you lots of graphs like this that then also break down the trends like this by the terciles, so the lowest access, the medium access, and the highest access. So places with the most restrictive policies, think camps and no right to work, or places that are allowing freedom of movement and allowing refugees the right to work. So the least access is the blue line, the medium access is the red line, and the gray bar is the most access. So the places that are allowing the most access for refugees. And so you can see in terms of the refugee population that basically right before the spike in refugee population, these populations are fairly similar, and then they all jump up. So a little bit less in the places with most access, a little bit more in places with the least access, but we see a jump in all three of these types, these groups of regions, and I'm going to break down then our outcomes by this same methodology. So this is not causal. Right? We're not looking at policy changes. We're actually interested in doing that in a different paper. This is just looking at, do regions evolve differently based on their labor market access before and after. Okay, so first, here is the economic outcomes over time. So again, on the vertical axis, sorry, this is in log of income, but that's at 8 is about 2,000 USD. You can see that actually, on average, that regions the income is decreasing on average before refugees arrive, and then increasing after refugees arrive on average. And so this is just a very simple event study that looks sort of before and after. In the paper, we also go through comparing this to other regions in the country, right? So regions where refugees have not arrived in the same numbers for a difference in differences specification for the researchers that then is comparing sort of time trends within the country, and we see similar results. So I'm going to present sort of the simplest formulation here. And so we are not seeing a sort of, significant, none of these are statistically significant, but we don't see a large sort of negative effect for sure of refugees arrive and host incomes go down on average. So then when we break this down, again, by places that have the most access compared to the least access, we're seeing that places with the most access are actually slightly poorer to start with, but they're sort of trending in the same directions. And we do see that the places with the most access decrease a little bit after refugees arrive compared to places where refugees have less access, that goes slightly up. So there is slight trends there when you look at it this way. But then when we look at the regression specification, we're not seeing any difference that's statistically significant between the places that are more inclusive versus less inclusive. So we don't think that there's really sort of much going on, even with the sort of little bit of trends in the picture. Then when we look at attitudes, again, sort of nothing really substantial sort of jumps out. So on the vertical axis is the percentage of people who say that this is a good place for immigrants to live, right? And so we can see that there's sort of not any significant changes before immigrants arrive. And then in the year after immigrants arrive, we see that dip slightly, but then actually recover into years 2 and 3. And so on average, across this sort of 4-year span, we're not seeing sort of a significant trend when we look at all of these. This is about, again, 110 regions. When we break this down, again, by places with most to least access, we can see that places with the least access are slightly less supportive of refugees right before they arrive. And so then it dips a little bit. So the places with the least access, actually it dips a little bit more. And so the places that are more restrictive are trying to avoid this effect. but it's, again, not present in the statistical specification. So we don't think that there's really sort of much of a difference when we look across places based on their entire low and medium access. And then so the last main result that I'll show is on political outcomes. And so we see that actually before refugees arrive, the approval rate of refugees is or approval rate of the national leader is about 50%. And then after refugees arrive in those areas, it actually increases. And so then here, when we break this down by least versus most access, we actually see that places with the most access, it jumps up, and the places with the least access, saw a little bit of a boost right before refugees arrived, but then this falls off. And so there's actually, the places, if the politicians were hoping that restricting refugees would boost their political arrival, it seems that comparing across these different regions, we actually see a little bit, if anything, it's sort of the opposite. Now, again, that's not significant in the statistical specifications. We don't think that there's actually much there. So when we look at a bunch of other different outcomes that are presented in the paper, I will not go through those today. And then just to summarize, we look at, again, sort of lots of different specifications here, but I'll wrap up and just say that sort of consistent with meta-analyses, we find little evidence of average effects from large refugee flows. And then we find little evidence that these effects vary based on their access to the labor market, which is a sort of key motivation that these hosting regions have. And so the policy implications of this, or this suggests, as Sandra presented in a sort of more specific case study, that labor market access policies in more contexts would make a significant difference for refugees without a sort of average cost to the host communities or governments. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ginn. Let me introduce you to our next expert, Colette Salemi. Colette Salemi got her PhD from University of Minnesota and joined the University of Victoria in 2022. Her current research examines the context of forced displacement and explore both the spillover effects of refugee camp on community and landscape. Colette also studied conservation and ecosystem, and she's interested in climate-induced migration and the complex relationship between climate shock and conflict. Colette, you have 20 minutes and to give us some insight.
Sounds good. All right. Greetings, everyone. Oh, that looks wonderful. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Colette Salemi. I'm very excited to share some joint work with you. I've been involved with an excellent team, including Jean-Francois Maestat, Anna Gostin, Julie Bousquet, who we'll hear from later on in this event, and Mark Cadigo. Our paper is entitled, Does Perceived Labor Market Competition Increase Prejudice Between Refugees and Their Local Hosts? Evidence from Ethiopia, or Uganda and Ethiopia. So the topic of social integration has come up many times already in this event. We know that UNHCR, governments, other partners do try to invest in integration in many ways, partly through your research, looking at intergroup contact and other sorts of interventions, but additionally through inclusive policies towards refugees and hosts. The hope is that we can bring refugees more directly into host labor markets and society to stimulate self-reliance, reduce aid dependency, and boost overall well-being for the population. Nevertheless, I think many of us have encountered negative attitudes towards refugees and migrants. I'm from the United States. This issue is quite salient in my home country right now. Now, many of us have also interacted with negative attitudes towards refugees and migrants that are often channeled through anxieties around job competition. And this observation largely helped inform the question that we decided to ask. We have done research before looking at how people react to refugees and migrants versus non-refugees, non-migrants. We wanted to look and see whether or not perceptions of labor market competition mediate those attitudes. And I think we figured out one experimental way to try to get at this question. So we conduct a survey experiment. Specifically, we do a vignette experiment where we actually got quite fortunate. We were able to add this vignette experiment to an already planned survey that was being rolled out by FAFO and the World Bank. We started working on it in 2020. The survey actually went out into the field in 2022. We surveyed refugees and the host community in rural and urban locations of Uganda and Ethiopia. And our vignette is quite short. It tells this fictional story of a job seeker. Interestingly, in the vignette, we randomize whether or not the character in the story is a refugee or a host, and whether or not they work in the same occupation or a different occupation as the respondent. And then immediately after exposing people to this vignette, we ask inclusion questions about the vignette character. Just to very quickly place us in the broader discourse, we see this work as a part of this ongoing conversation around increasing refugee inclusion. We've already in this panel, or sorry, in this event, discussed past work examining the contact hypothesis, whether or not just promoting contact can be helpful. Our work partly speaks to contact hypothesis. I'll get to that later on. There's also been experiments in which hosts were just given cash and said, okay, will this help improve attitudes towards refugees? Interestingly, the Bassirou et al. Paper finds that when the cash is framed as a part of, you're getting this because of the refugee support, attitudes do improve. The other papers have quite null results for the effect of cash on host attitudes towards refugees. We were really inspired, though, by a set of vignette experiments that have been done with Native populations to either understand how they see refugees and migrants, or to even try to solicit a change in their perceptions. So some of the past vignettes have exposed people to updated information. Some of them have tried to help the reader or respondent empathize with the migrant population. We actually borrow from existing vignette experiments where they emphasize a shared commonality between the respondent and the migrant or refugee population. So one of these experiments, for example, just reminded respondents that their families had histories of displacement, and we see a sort of a short-run attitudinal response. We really build off of Lazarev and Sharma, which is a 2017 paper conducted in Turkey, where they simply mentioned to respondents that Syrian refugees belong to the same religious group as they do. And then they looked at how that affected willingness to give to a refugee charity, attitudes, etc. Where we differ is that Lazarev and Sharma are trying to share a commonality that may boost pro-social behavior, or maybe like a sense of connection, whereas we are emphasizing a commonality that may signal competition instead of accord. So of course, our work is also in conversation with past research on anti-migrant prejudice. Our reading of the literature is that there are these two primary explanations that are often examined. The first is that private economic concerns may influence and drive these attitudes. So for example, fear over job competition would be a private economic concern. Fear of competition over land, private economic concern. But there's also these sociotropic factors, these broader existential fears about the changing identity of one's nation, if a particular population does not value diversity. And it's also possible that very often anti-migrant prejudice is actually influenced by these sociotropic threats, as opposed to the private economic ones. The literature is somewhat mixed. I look forward to talking to some of you about this, including Dr. Maida, who works in this space. There's a common finding among some of the authors that it's the sociotropic factors that are more salient than the private economic ones. There are some exceptions to this too. Of course, the context may matter as well. In terms of labor market competition, for example, it may matter if the native population has more complementary or substitutable skills with the migrant population. Those sort of factors may play a role. So to give you a sense of our context, here's a quick map. The red dots are showing, broadly speaking, the rough geolocations of where our surveys were conducted. In Uganda, we targeted Kampala, hosts and refugees responded to our survey. And our rural location is the Isingiro district, where Naki Valley refugee settlement is located. In Ethiopia, we sampled populations in Addis Ababa. We also went out to the Kaburabia camp, which is in the Jijiga region in eastern Ethiopia. I know that we've already gone through some of these policies so far. As many of us know, Uganda has been praised for having very self-reliance oriented policies that are sometimes seen as a means through which we can boost refugee inclusion. We've already talked about the rights to work. I think we've touched on the rights to land. I think another unique feature about the Ugandan encampment model is the fact that the settlements are extremely large. I mean, Naki Valley is 185 square kilometers. Ethiopia had more restrictive policies in the past, but they are moving towards more liberal refugee hosting policies. Any refugees that are encamped are in smaller area camps as opposed to settlements. And increasingly over time, we've seen increasing expansion on the right of refugees to live outside of camps and to work legally. Thank you. I'll start going a little bit more quickly. One thing to note about our study context is that we are collecting data at the tail end of the Tigray War. This follows a large, in relative terms, increase in the refugee population of Addis Ababa. So there may be a perception that this population is growing. That doesn't change the fact that the population of Addis Ababa is still, there's very few refugees there. I mean, it's 1.7% of the overall population of the city. But this may be playing a role in what we end up finding. So I'm going to go a little bit quickly through data collection. Just trust us that we thought about it and we tried to collect some pretty representative data. Our paper is currently on the program. I welcome you to take a look at it for finer details. I want to bring attention here to the fact that, you know, the figure on the top shows our wish list of sample sizes. We ended up with much smaller samples. However, particularly in Addis Ababa, we did not sample many refugees. They were hard to find. And then the Kaburabia and Jijiga sample is relatively small for refugees and hosts. Let's go quickly through the vignette. So again, it's very, very short. We tried to make the names of the characters neutral and we matched them to the gender of the respondent. So each respondent heard a little story about Ida and Robert, who's either a Ugandan or a refugee living in Uganda. This is the vignette for Ethiopia. It's parallel to that, to Uganda. It's parallel to Ethiopia. And then we tell you that this person's been living there their whole life. And then we match to the location, and that they've been working in either the matched occupation for the respondent, which we obtained from earlier in the survey, or we assign them to a different occupation of a comparable skill profile. And then we keep going and telling this story that, oh, they're looking for a job. Take a look at the paper if you want to read that in greater detail. And then we ask a bunch of questions about, you know, whether or not you'd be willing to engage with this fictional character. which we then, similar to Thomas's previous presentation, we then combine all of these discrete scale questions into an index. The most important thing for you to keep in mind for the audience is that within our index, we have standard deviation changes. A 0.2 standard deviation change is small, 0.5 is medium. Keep those in mind, right? It's going to help with understanding the results. Otherwise, it's hard to think in magnitudes in these terms. So our estimation strategy is quite simple. We basically ended up randomizing on two variables, whether or not you're exposed to an outgroup member or whether or not you're exposed to someone in the same occupation, which we then interacted. There's effectively 4 different groups of treatment along those 2 binary dimensions. We control for some other characteristics. Here's the most important thing to notice for now, like maybe take a quick note. The alpha-1 term here, the variables, the coefficients have very specific interpretations. So alpha-1 represents the effective exposure to a vignette character who's in the respondent's out-group working in a different occupation relative to the in-group member working in a different occupation. So for alpha-1, we're only comparing those exposed to different occupation vignette character, out-group versus in-group. So that shows you that, okay, if someone's not competing, hypothetically, how do we react? Alpha-2, I'm going to spend less time on. That's more just about like, how do you respond to someone who has the same job as you? Alpha-3 is really our variable of interest. It's the effective exposure to an out-group member who's in the same occupation in the vignette relative to all other treatments. Thank you. So our main results, one thing that the World Bank really wanted us to stress, because we first looked at this result, like, oh, okay, I think we're getting onto something with our experiment. The World Bank wanted us to stress that alpha-1, in the absence of perceived labor market competition, hosts do not have different attitudes towards refugees. And they were like, that is a good thing, right? So make sure to emphasize that there's some positives that are coming out of these main results. However, it does appear as though our respondents, when they are hosts who are exposed to a refugee working in the same occupation, the vignette, they do indeed report significantly more negative attitudes. But notice that within the Anderson Index, the magnitude of this effect is small. Now, one thing that's a little confusing, by the way, is that within this index, positive means more antagonistic. So positive means more negative, and I know that's a bit confusing, right? I just want to clarify that right now. But we saw this and thought, okay, maybe we're actually really onto something. The reality, though, is that when we break it up by location, we find a lot of variation. In fact, it appears that our main result is primarily driven by hosts in Addis Ababa, where we find a medium-sized effect in terms of the influence of being exposed to a vignette character who is a refugee, as opposed to any other who's working in the same occupation. In Kampala, interestingly, despite all of the efforts to promote refugee inclusion, we actually find a significant result on that alpha-1 term. So that it appears that when we're presented with people who are working in a different occupation as you, hosts are reporting more negative attitudes towards refugees. I should note really quickly, I'm not dwelling much on the results for our refugee sample. We were excited to look at how refugees respond to hosts. They're mostly quite null. And remember, in some study contexts, the sample size is quite small. I want to go through really quickly, just like 1 or 2 points for heterogeneity, especially because I went home and remade these graphs last night. They were tables. I made them into graphs. So okay, great. I have 2 minutes. Perfect. So we wanted to dig more into these Ethiopia results because this is a context where refugees make up a very small share of the labor market, but we're seeing this negative reaction to the vignette character when they're working in the same occupation. So what we decided to do, given the fact that refugees are such a small share of the labor market, was we identified in our sample which respondents work in an industry location where hosts are overrepresented relative to the locational mean, and who's working in an industry where hosts are underrepresented relative to the mean. Interestingly, that negative reaction to a vignette character working in the same occupation who's a refugee is driven by those who don't work with many refugees in their industries. We also wanted to inspect and see whether or not the quality of refugee-host interaction makes a difference. So in this figure, we examined how the respondent reacts to the vignette character and break it up based on whether or not the respondent speaks the same language as the dominant refugee or outgroup in that region. And again, what we find is that when there is some evidence that having that ability to communicate is making a difference in these results. When the respondent who's a host speaks a different language than the primary refugee group, the response to the vignette character who's a refugee working in the same job is indeed more negative, whereas it's quite null when they actually share a language. And then the final one, we do basically the same exercise based on whether or not you have at least one friend, just one, in the outgroup. And the results look so similar to the language results that I had to double check them last night. But indeed, we more or less get the same pattern. So there's a lot to work with here. We're still reflecting on these results. We'd love to dig more into how labor market characteristics in particular areas are mediating them. But I'm just about out of time, so I'm going to close it up there. I look forward to talking more about some of this work with you all during the remainder of the event. So thank you so much.
I would like to reassure the audience that you have time to ask a few questions after our first panelist, but you also have a time to interact with the expert during coffee break. Thank you. So our next panelist is May. She will talk to us about she will talk to us about attitude toward refugee posting and integration policies, evidence for Kenya. Let me tell you that May is a PhD in political science at Stanford University of Humanities and Science. And she graduated with a job first class bachelor degree in philosophy from Oxford. Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. So I was saying that May graduated from University of Oxford with a double first class bachelor degree in philosophy, politics, and economics. May works on volunteer as an international refugee, and May volunteer with international refugee and underrepresented entrepreneur and intern in the House of Parliament. May, you have the floor.
Wow, Bassirou, thank you so much for that introduction. Hi everyone, as Bassirou said, I'm May. I'm a PhD candidate at Stanford. It's a real honor to be here today, so thank you to JDC for organizing this incredible event. I'm going to be presenting some work today with a co-author of mine at the Immigration Policy Lab, Adam Lichtenheld. It's based on some exploratory fieldwork I've been doing over the past couple of years, so I'm really excited to share this with you and to hear your feedback. So to motivate this research, around the world, we've seen a promising trend in governments implementing refugee integration policies. Now, most people in the room know what refugee integration is. We're talking about refugees having improved rights to work, move, and build sustainable livelihoods in their countries of asylum. Some prominent examples of this include Uganda, Jordan, Ethiopia, and Colombia. Now, we know that there are some issues with some of these policies, but nevertheless, we have seen countries moving towards more liberal refugee policies when it comes to integration. As policymakers and academics, there are a few questions we might ask about this trend. How do these integration policies affect the locals that host refugees? Do we see backlash to refugee integration? Now, the existing research that we have doesn't really allow us to answer these questions fully. So we have seen a huge increase in research assessing public attitudes towards refugees over the past few years. But this research has largely been concentrated in high-income countries, and it's been focused on refugee arrivals and refugee presence rather than shifts towards refugee integration policies. The findings of this research have largely been that refugees are met with hostility and they're associated with increased support for right-wing parties. This has largely been the result of the Syrian refugee influx in Europe, which has prompted this research. So there's been less focus, as I said, on these attitudes towards refugee integration policies in low and middle income countries. This is despite this being the main change in terms of refugee policy over the past couple of decades, and that every 3 in 4 refugees lives in the global south. So it's kind of interesting that this main policy shift towards refugee integration that's happening in low and middle income countries hasn't really been studied. We don't really know what the effects of these policies are or how people respond to them. We expect that in some conditions in low and middle income countries, we might find more welcoming attitudes. For example, when there's ethnic kinship, which is more common in the global south, given that borders are often drawn between ethnic kin. When there's been a history of circular movement across porous or fluid borders, so communities know each other across the border. And when there's been foreign aid for refugees. So refugees have been associated with improvements in infrastructure and services. So even though our research suggests that attitudes towards refugees in Europe and the US is largely negative, we might think that some of these integration policies in low and middle income countries could actually lead to maybe positive attitudes and more welcoming attitudes. So to start to grapple with some of these questions, we're going to use a timing of a policy change in Kenya. So Kenya is one of these countries that's actually been quite restrictive when it comes to its refugee policy. The 2006 Refugees Act makes it very difficult for refugees to move and to work. Refugees can get work permits, but it's almost impossible for them to get work permits. It's really, really hard. There are 2 huge refugee camps in Kenya and some refugees living in Nairobi as well, but largely restrictive policies. In 2021, this started to change. So Kenya passed a new Refugees Act in 2021. Now, there are many components of this act, some of which are negative around detention and access to asylum, but some of the components of this on integration are really positive. So I'm going to highlight 3 components here. Firstly, transitioning refugee camps into integrated settlements. So if we're familiar with settlements in Uganda, this is moving Kenya from its Nkamba model to more Uganda-style integrated settlements where both hosts and refugees can access the same services and live together, and there's broader freedom of movement in those areas. An increase in the right to work through improved access to work permits, access to bank accounts and M-Pesa, which is mobile money in Kenya. And then changes to freedom of movement. So the Refugee Act will allow refugees to move freely in designated areas. We're not quite sure what those designated areas will be yet. The Kenyan government haven't said exactly what those areas will be, but we do know there'll be improved movement in those areas. And then also refugees from the East African community, which includes the 2 largest refugee groups in Kenya, Somalia and South Sudan, will be able to become EAC citizens, so East African community citizens, and have the full rights to freedom of movement and work rights. I should say here that this policy was enacted in 2021, but it hasn't yet been implemented. So this provides us with quite a unique time frame to be able to understand the effects of this policy by putting in place a survey prior to the policy being implemented and then studying changes over time. So that's what we did. I should also say that the policy is supposed to be being enacted in November of this year and might go to early next year. And there are some details that are still being ironed out, like what the designated areas will be. So the final study design will depend on how the policy is eventually implemented. But these are our main ideas for now. So the study design. I'm going to talk about 2 different parts of the study today. I'm going to start by talking about the overall panel study, which is the overarching goal of this research. And then I'm going to talk about some questions that we ask in the baseline and then go through those baseline findings. So the overarching question of the research is, how does being affected by a refugee policy change attitudes towards refugees and the government? So what we're going to be doing is a longitudinal phone survey with the same Kenyan citizens before, during and after the Sharika plan is implemented. So that's We did the baseline last year in September and October. We're going to be conducting the midline after the Sharika plan has been implemented in November. So the midline will be early next year. And then the end line will be after the Sharika plan has been implemented. We're following up with the same people over time using a survey company called TIFA, which is based in Nairobi, and they do political polling in Kenya. So to understand cause and effect, what we plan to do is to compare the changes in attitudes of people who are living in the areas that are neighboring the refugee camps to the rest of the population. As I said earlier, we don't know what the exact implementation of the policy will be, so our way of doing cause and effect, our inference strategy, might change over time. We might move to a more individual matching strategy, but we're not 100% sure until we know how the Kenyan government is actually going to implement this policy. We also leverage some other data. So we're going to be leveraging administrative data. The UN is conducting a panel on outcomes for refugees and hosts in the refugee camp area. So we're going to be leveraging that data. We're excited to say that we just hired a refugee consultant who's a researcher and a journalist who's going to be leading a qualitative component to this research. And we've also been doing consultations with NGOs, stakeholders, and refugee leaders. I lived in Kenya for 8 months over the past year, so a lot of this comes from conversations with local leaders. Now, our baseline survey that we conducted in September and October of last year, we had a nationally representative sample of 2,400 people, so this is all throughout the Kenyan public, and then an oversample in the refugee camp areas of 900 people across the two. So as I said before, our plan is to compare these refugee camp areas to the rest of the population over time. Ooh. Okay, great. So we conduct 3 different kinds of data collection. The first is observational, which we're going to be using for the panel study. So we wanted to ask who is most likely to support and oppose refugees. We assess some of the factors that we know might affect support or opposition, as have been spoken about by our other panelists today, including ethnic kinship, contact, economic vulnerability, sociotropic concerns, so concerns for the Kenyan economy, and other demographic factors like age, marriage, and education. We also conduct 2 survey experiments within the baseline. So one thing we were interested in is whether support varies for different dimensions of a refugee integration policy. So we talk about these integration policies, but actually they're bundles of different things. Like refugees getting the right to work is quite different to refugees being able to move freely, which is quite different to refugees sharing services. Oh, slow, sorry. Okay, slow, sorry. It's quite different to refugees accessing services with locals. So we wanted to understand whether support for refugee integration varies depending on the kind of policy that's involved in integration. We also wanted to understand whether there's variation in support for different refugee nationalities. So if anyone's been to Kenya and has studied migration in Kenya, you might know that there's discrimination towards Somali refugees because of associations with Al-Shabaab and like historical associations with terrorism. And yet Somalis are also very close to Kenyans. Somali refugees are also very close to Kenyan Somalis and have very strong business networks. So when I was doing fieldwork, I found that Somalis are treated in quite a different way in Kenya. So I wanted to formally study that and ask, why do we see this? What are the main reasons for different kinds of discrimination? And then finally, we had a qualitative component to the survey. So we asked 2 open-ended questions. Firstly, why do citizens support or oppose refugee hosting? And then what do they think the effects of the integration policy will be? So this was also done over the phone. So I'm going to preview some of the findings from the baseline survey. So to go to our observational data, some good news is that there were high levels of support for both refugee hosting and integration. So on the left-hand side is support for refugee hosting, and on the right-hand side is refugee policy preference. So on the hosting, from the left, it's strongly opposed to strongly support. And 68% of the Kenyan population supported hosting refugees. On the right-hand side, you see that full rights, which is on the furthest right, is by far and away the most preferred policy of Kenyans. It's 4 times more popular than the policy of camps that the Kenyan government currently has. So this is quite exciting news that Kenyans largely support refugee hosting and refugee integration. We also find that support is higher in the refugee hosting areas. So here's a map of Kenya. The red triangles are where the camps are. On the left-hand side is refugee hosting, and on the right-hand side is support for refugee integration. And what you see is that areas where the refugee camps are there's higher levels of support, particularly for refugee hosting. For refugee integration, there's more support in Garissa than there is in Turkana. But we see generally there's support for refugees in these refugee hosting areas, which contradicts some of the findings that we've seen in the global north, which is that exposure to refugees actually leads to more hostility. We don't see that in Kenya. So who are these people that are supporting or opposing refugees? So we find that it's educated citizens and those with ethnic kinship and close contact to refugees that are most likely to support refugee hosting. So here's a coefficient plot. We see the biggest predictors of refugee support are ethnic kin. Sorry, you can't really see the words here, so I'll spell them out. So ethnic kin, so if someone's a Somali, then they are more likely to support refugees. Those who have close contact with refugees, so that's people who have a friend, a neighbor, a family member, and those with high levels of education. We don't find any correlation with economic vulnerability. We also don't find any correlation with people who've been previously displaced. So this is largely due to election violence in 2007, 2008. Those people, we don't see that they're more likely to support refugees. We also don't see a difference in terms of gender. We do find that people that are older, married, and have socio-tropic concerns about Kenya's economy are more hostile towards refugees. We were then interested in who is this minority. So here in this plot of support for refugee hosting, what we found was that attitudes were actually pretty polarized. We weren't really expecting this. In the past, previous literature has suggested that in sub-Saharan Africa, refugees are not really a political issue, therefore people are kind of neutral. But we didn't find that in the study. What we found was actually polarized attitudes, that there's high levels of support, but there's also this substantial minority that really strongly opposes refugees. And we think this is an important question for policymakers. Who are these people? How are they going to respond to the policy? So we investigated this. We found that these people were more likely to be married and have socio-tropic concerns about the economy. So these are people that are really worried about the effect of refugees on Kenya's economy. We found that they weren't really geographically concentrated. They were dispersed across the country. Another interesting thing that we found was that the people that are very opposed, people that wanted to send refugees back, when we gave them information about work rights, they then became more supportive of refugees. So the people that are concerned about the effect of refugees on the economy, when you tell them that refugees can work, they then become more supportive of refugees. So it kind of contradicts the way that we think about economic perceptions of refugees. So I've got 2 minutes, so I'm going to go through these quite quickly. In terms of our experiments, we find broad support for all dimensions of the policy, but highest levels of support for settlements, then work, and then freedom of movement. The other experiment, we found that there was much lower rates of support for Somali refugees. Descriptively, support dropped from 68% of people supporting refugees broadly to 34% supporting Somali refugees. So that's a drop of 50% in support. So even though we have these high-level findings of high levels of support, this really isn't the case for Somali refugees. So something to think about. And then in the qualitative data, a really encouraging finding is that the main reason for high levels of support was humanitarian concerns. So this is just a simple coding of, in the open-ended data, what do people talk about? On the left-hand side is saying something about humanitarian concerns. So I can't really read this because I'm out of time, but here are some quotes that I'll leave you with. So like really endearing findings about people saying like, these are people that need support. They've been tortured. They have no food. We have a peaceful country. Let them come here. And that's not a story that we see very often in research about public attitudes towards refugees. When it comes to the integration policy, we found that people were concerned about security when it comes to movement and settlements, but with work, people actually thought that this would lead to positive economic outcomes rather than negative economic outcomes. Okay, so to conclude, I'm going to skip through these because I'm out of time, but high levels of support for refugee hosting and integration, support is highest in refugee-hosted areas, attitudes are polarized with a substantial minority opposing, citizens support all dimensions of the refugee integration policy, Kenyans are less supportive of Somali refugees, the main reason for high levels of support is humanitarian concerns, and citizens feel that work rights will actually improve Kenya's economy. We think that these findings are promising, suggesting that refugees are welcome in Kenya and that citizens are supportive of refugee integration. We're now really looking forward to conducting this panel survey, the midline next year, the end line that follows, to see what the effects of this integration policy are long term. So thank you all very much. Really looking forward to your questions and feedback.
Thank you, May, for this interesting result and finding, and that will hopefully inform policies in different areas. Right. Okay, now you have the floor. The first person to ask a question. I have 3 hands. Number 1. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And then number 2 and number 3. Questions?
Hello. Very interesting presentations. So a couple of points. First of all, as the first point to Colette, I have found myself that perceptions of labor market competition matter for attitudes. And so it is important to stress that those are perceptions, which is, quite different from the objective actual effects. But it is important to see that people seem to be thinking about these labor market effects. And related to what you do, I have a suggestion for Thomas for the paper to find a little bit more action in the data. So you seem to you exploit the variation in terms of policies, but maybe you could also exploit variation at the individual level in terms of the occupation, education level, and I think there you would find more action in the data.
Thank you for, both of you. So my question is for Colette. So I was wondering the differences between the Uganda and the Ethiopian context. In particular, Ethiopia has been exposed to a big internal displacement. And if you could develop a bit more about if they perceive IDPs as refugees and the threat that they identify might be different, right? That might lead the results, in particular in Addis Ababa. And in particular, how do you quantify, right? I mean, the actual threat for each data point, right? I mean, it's sample, yes. Thank you.
Phil.
Thank you for the presentation. So I have 2 comments. One for Thomas. I think I second Anna Maria. I think a lot has to do with power, statistical power, and you will get more by looking at individual variations instead of country. And the second point on the perceptions, what is about actually eliciting perceptions or eliciting what people think the right answer should be? And I think before you need to interpret it as actual perceptions, actual votes, actual polarization of attitudes. To what extent do we believe in the type of elicitation that we're doing?
Okay, we'll give a chance to our panelists to answer those 3 questions, and we'll take 1 or 2 more after that.
Thank you. I'll start if everybody doesn't mind. I totally agree with Anna Maria about this being a perception, and it's a little confusing in our work because we're trying to stimulate a perception, but then we're also thinking about whether or not individuals have any experience interacting with refugees, which almost adds this additional layer of perception, I guess you could say. But I completely agree with you, right? Like it could be very much the case that it's those who have a perception that there's a problem, despite the fact that it's not necessarily manifesting. In terms of Ethiopia versus Ugandan context, of course, there's lots of differences. In terms of internal displacement explicitly, you know, it's interesting being here now versus where we were in 2020 because we didn't really talk about thinking about IDPs within the Ethiopian context and how salient that was to our sample. And now I feel like that was a missed opportunity. I'm at least reassured that when we are presenting people with a vignette character, we make it very explicit that a migrant, a displaced person in that scenario is indeed someone who is a refugee from another place. But I can't help but feel pretty remiss that we had not made all of those connections to, especially at a time when there was a conflict going on that was clearly creating internal displacement. That is a limitation of our study that we need to acknowledge. Regarding asking these, you know, the challenge of asking hypothetical questions to try to solicit real behavior, I completely agree. Like, we have to be mindful, and I do have these, you know, we talked about limitations of some of these sorts of surveys yesterday in one of the talk, and hypothetical bias is certainly one of them. You're asking people a very hypothetical scenario. I think also the comment gets at strategic behavior. Lots of these populations have interacted with us before. They might have a sense of what's going on with the experiment. We're a little reassured by the fact that what our experimental procedure is very quick and it's not maybe immediately apparent what is going on for the respondent in terms of catching on to, oh, this is what I should tell the World Bank because they want me to say that I like refugees per se. On top of that, in terms of predicting actual behavior, I agree it's a little ambiguous. There's been a bit of research looking at if vignette experiments accurately predict real world behavior by connecting the outcome of a vignette like ours to how someone voted, whether or not they're willing to give to a charity. The main result is that when the activity is lower cost, it's more likely that the self-reported behaviors will line up with true behavior. We argue in our paper that the cost of interacting with other people is pretty low, but in reality, and maybe some of the practitioners in the room will know more, these costs may be higher than we perceive. That was a really long-winded response, so thank you. I can just go on forever.
Thank you so much, Anna-Maria. I completely agree. I think one thing we see in some of the other papers on sort of effects on host communities is this effect on inequality, right? That, you know, maybe more educated people sometimes benefit from refugees arriving while the lower educated might be harmed. And so you see this like the inequality increase, even if the average doesn't change. So that's definitely a next step that we want to look at and then see if, you know, in those same groups that those attitude and other outcomes then evolve the same way. Tuan, totally agree with you about power. I mean, we've got, like at the individual level, it's about 90,000 observations in these like main districts in that 10,000 cutoff specification. So there's a lot of sort of wiggle room there, but it sort of can get thin fast, especially because the treatment is at the, you know, regional level. And then as far as sort of, you know, what people's, the response that they're expecting, I think I would expect any sort of, you know, thing on political approval or whatever to be somewhat consistent across time, or maybe sort of not very exactly along the level of when refugees arrived. And this is also a battery of a lot of different variety of different questions. So it's not sort of keyed in on any sort of immigration or political thing. It's about, you know, access to a lot of different dimensions of life. So not key that there's sort of any expectation from Gallup around what people are expected to say, but totally agree. That's a concern.
Okay, we may take one more. Oh, 3. Okay. All right. So let's do the, no, one? Go ahead. Okay, so we'll take the last 3 questions. Start with hey. Get the mic.
Good morning. My question is for May. It's quite interesting that of the people who are opposed and concerned about the economy of Kenya, they said when you tell them refugees have the right to work, they change. I'm curious to know what were their assumptions prior to that. How do they think refugees would hurt the economy? Is it like they were expecting the Kenyan government to be giving them free handouts or whatever? Just curious to know what were their assumptions before.
Thank you, first of all, to all three of you. I think it's really, I love these sessions because the perceptions and attitudes is really an underrated, or has been for a long time, an underrated aspect in research, but also in how we go about strategically and in our advocacy, and how we can leverage insights like the ones you've produced. I have one suggestion and one question for follow-up. The suggestion is to all three of you. In fact, you may have seen that during World Refugee Day, UNHCR launched the global survey on attitudes towards refugees. And I wonder, I'm not sure, I haven't looked at the data across, but I wonder how much that could help to compare across. I appreciate you're doing panel series, more granularity, so there will be issues, but it's very interesting thinking specifically of the Gallup World Poll, that we have that additional data set also to help validate or cross compare with. So that's one. The second one is to Thomas specifically, and maybe we can pick that up on the side. I wonder, you jumped around in terms of terminology between refugee, migrant, immigrant, and I wonder to what extent combining data sets with a fundamentally different concepts is an issue. Now, I'm not trying to pivot towards the legal side of this point, but more the perception and the cognitive testing aspect of it. So just curious to explore that a bit further, because of course it has important bearings then on what we in particular in UNHCR can do in terms of refugee advocacy, but when it comes to using this data, I mean. But again, thanks very much. 3 great presentations.
Thank you all. Great session. I have 2 questions for Colette. One is, how are you guys thinking about the contact hypothesis in your context? Because if it's with like Alport contact hypothesis, we have this cooperation assumption, and then in the labor market, when we talk about labor markets, that becomes a little bit more tricky to think about this cooperation assumption holding. The other is about same occupation, and did you consider exploring whether different occupations could be substitutes or complements of each other, because that could also affect how people reason about competing. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
All right, we'll let our panelists answer those 2 questions.
Charles, thank you so much for the question. So on your question, which is about these people that were concerned about refugees coming in terms of Kenya's economy, then they get information about work rights, and then they're more supportive. What are the assumptions that they have? So it's difficult for me to say exactly what their assumptions are because we didn't ask them that. But what we are seeing in the open-ended data is that people think the work rights will create job and business opportunities. So it seems like there's this perception that refugees are maybe using services, that they are not contributing to the Kenyan economy, but if they can work and they have that ability to do that, they're supported by the government, then that will improve jobs and business opportunities. I'm excited to dig in more into the qualitative data because I think there's more to unpack there. Actually, I wanted to make a comment on the global survey on attitudes. So I've digged through this data. I think it's really, really exciting. One limitation I found is it's only using online samples. So in Kenya, it said something like 97% support refugees. And so what we often find is that those that are online are more likely to be younger, they're more likely to be more positive. So it's really cool that this data exists, but I think when it comes to low and middle income countries, it's kind of hard to infer what do people actually think. But yeah, it's a really exciting data initiative.
So thank you, Enrique, for those great questions. In terms of how we're thinking about contact hypothesis, we're seeing it as a way, we're thinking about contact in our context as a way to better understand what we're finding in the main results. We acknowledge that within our study, we're not making a causal claim about how contact is causing these behavioral responses to change, because we're not randomly assigning people to new friends, right? So it's unclear whether or not people are more prosocial towards the outgroup and therefore have a friend and are more likely to say that they be more prosocial towards our vignette character, or if it's due to the fact that they have a friend that they react that way, is what I'm trying to say. So for now, we caveat in the paper that this helps us understand the results, but it doesn't necessarily mean that our policy conclusions are to match everybody up with a friend. I wish it was that easy, but maybe it is, right? I know that's, Enrique, that's what some of your work is looking at, actually bringing people together. In terms of the occupational substitutability and complementarity, this is another one of those things that really makes me wish I had a time machine. Because when we were assigning and thinking about how to design the occupational matching, we effectively looked at the predominant occupations in our data. And then we just thought just in terms of skill level, we didn't think about complementarity or substitutability. And immediately I'm thinking, for example, so many of our respondents are farmers. What if one of those alternative occupations was a seed entrepreneur? Maybe they would have reacted differently, as opposed to, well, now they're being matched to a porter or a day laborer. So this is a really tricky part of, this is my first experiment, and one of the hardest parts is the regret. But this is indeed another limitation that we could bring up, is that we could have maybe been more deliberate about that. I mean, there's also the possibility of learning from what we've done and trying to do this again in a new context with a bigger sample, I think, to dig into differences, and also a little bit more control about, okay, bringing back all of this feedback. So thank you.
Colette, let me say this. Yes, you may have regret, but this is opportunity for further research. Ask UNHCR to provide you some money of the World Bank to complete this research. Okay, one more question online before we leave.
Yeah, thank you very much. We do have one question online. It's to all presenters, but I'd like to pose it Thomas, thinking about what you presented yesterday as well. So kind of bridging the two papers, if you don't mind. And the question is about whether there is any possibility to extend this to also study small business opportunities, and how this facilitate integration, considering that several countries are now opening up for this type of opportunities. So whether there is any relation with what you've seen today, but also in relation to business opportunity, in particular small business opportunities.
That's an interesting. Let me start with, I think Volker also had a point about the terminology around immigrants. So first, the global survey is really interesting. I'm excited to dig into that, but I didn't know about it, so thanks a lot. On the immigrants part, it's certainly not perfect that the attitudes question is really the one where we're constrained to just use the immigrants terminology that Gallup uses in that question. The other data is specific on refugees with UNHCR, and with the DRAP is specific toward refugee policy. And so the best we can say is that we correlate that to other measures that are specific to refugees. And those are correlated both sort of within individual, in the few surveys that Gallup asks both of those questions, and within regions where other surveys have come in and asked about attitudes toward refugees, much more detailed around refugee policy and things like that, that regions that report higher levels of this is a good place to live for immigrants also report more sort of support on, I'd be willing to live, have a refugee as a neighbor, refugees are, more support inclusion here and things like that. So So yeah, I think that's really the best that we can say with these data and with this methodology. And the other part is we're still working on sort of how many immigrants are at least at the national level and what proportion refugees constitute of that for all of these countries. The data's not great, but in some of these countries, for sure, refugees are going to make up a large proportion of the immigrants. And so kind of stay tuned for what that actually looks like in some of those regions. In Domenico, on sort of opportunities for small businesses, I mean, I think, you know, the message of what we talked about yesterday is that really, you know, and sort of building on some of Colette's work too, is that like small businesses, you know, can be open to the possibility of sort of refugees being there, especially with sort of the right environment. So, I mean, in terms of like the right to work, I think that, I mean, one idea that interests me is that giving people the right to work might allow some businesses that are forced to be in sort of the informal small business sector to actually formalize or to take formal jobs and things like that and actually reduce some kind of competition. And so that ability for refugees to sort of realize their skills might actually sort of reduce competition within some of the like micro entrepreneur, maybe more informal sectors. And so that may be sort of one area where, again, like some hosts might also benefit from more access to the labor market. So that's one idea. Thank you very much.
Just a comment on your answer to our friend. Maybe if you restrict it or you create a new sample specifically to refugee instead of immigrant, maybe we'll have different results, maybe better results, and that's maybe also something you can think about, because you know that in many countries around the world, people have different perception for immigrants, especially host countries have the ability to select or impose criteria on immigrants, but refugee is very difficult, right?
Yeah, so just to respond to that, yes. So the refugees arriving, that is actually refugees according to UNHCR's definition. The attitudes measure is about immigrants more broadly, and there we would love to restrict it to just the questions that ask about refugees specifically. But unfortunately, there's not many surveys that look kind of both before and after and in sort of multiple places about attitudes specifically toward refugees. So that's where the studies that are sort of within each individual country are going to be a sort of more specific look at that question than we're able to do with this methodology. But thanks a lot.
Yeah, so let's have an advocacy for donors here to give us the opportunity to explore that in the near future, because it's an important question, right? So again, let me please, from my friend, look at the way that we get some money for him to cover this study. All right. Okay, with that, let's we'll close this session and I will see you. Thank you so much. Let's take a picture. Yeah, you have a great energy. Let's take a picture together. Yeah. Okay, wonderful.
Don't off stage. I've done that before with a kid. It was so funny.
Hi, we're just gonna take now 15 minutes break, and then we'll resume at 40. No, 45. Yeah. And then I wanted to also, like, we have set up a separate media room somewhere around there. If any of you would like to speak with the media or something on that will be posted later on any of our platforms, please feel free to coordinate. Coordinate with Catherine Perkins here. Thank you.
Yeah, let's do that. But anything that has keeping clean, will reuse. So we don't. Then any.
Well, remove all the papers.
Yeah. Yeah, let's remove all this. And then let's remove all the chairs and tables away. And let It's just next to it. Yeah. Didn't break. It's good. Thank you so much, Laura. Yes, she's going to have a look at this for you, I think. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. No, I'm fine. Want something? Are you good? Yeah, what is perfect? Thank you. Well,